Hi and welcome to the Bible channel. This is our fourth episode in our series Famous Last Words, revealing the miracle of Israel's restoration. Was it coincidence or divine providence? In this thought-provoking Bible talk, we explore the astonishing events that led to the rebirth of Israel in 1948. From a Frenchman's wrongful conviction to a pharmacist's accidental discovery and an emu feather's role in the battle. Every detail points to a greater plan. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe, and drop us a comment in the comment section if you found this video helpful.
In 1881, that's a map of the extent of the Ottoman Empire as it then existed, coming towards the end of 400 years of a magnificent empire that was centred on the ancient city of Constantinople that we know today as Istanbul. The Ottomans were basically the modern-day Turks, but they had ruled a large area for many centuries. And part of that area was the area known as Palestine, which was a quiet backwater. I'll make a little comment about Palestine that might be surprising to some of you. Palestine has never, in the whole history of the world, existed as a nation, and it still doesn't today, as we know, which is a source of great controversy in the world, but it has never been a nation. It was an area, much like the Coorong is an area of South Australia and the Riverland and so forth. Gippsland is an area of Victoria, so it was that the Romans called the area that had been Israel, they called it Palestine, to define it as a geographical area. In 1881, the area of Palestine had a population of around 500,000, made up of around 50,000 Jews, 50,000 Christians, and about 400,000 Muslims. And it was a quiet backwater that was really of not a great deal of interest to anyone, except perhaps the Jews and the Arabs that lived there, and of course, Bible students. Today, it is the nation of Israel. A nation of almost 10 million people, 8 million of whom are Jews. A nation that is in the top 10 most powerful military nations on the planet. A nation that seems to be at the centre of so much conflict, but is also at the centre of so many solutions. Israel is the software capital of the world. In fact, the software giant, Microsoft, would say that they are essentially an Israeli company, even though they're listed on the US stock market, because that's where most of the software is developed. So Israel, in that period since 1881, has become a very influential, very successful nation, albeit one that is still at the centre of so much controversy. Now, what caused that to happen? This was a writer, and I apologise if the print's a little small up there. This was a writer, Anton LaGuardia, who wrote a book called War Without End. He lived in Jerusalem for several decades. He was a journalist and an author. A very good book, actually. I've read it several times, just because I forgot after 20 years the first time I'd read it. I would say it's quite apolitical. He probably leans more to the Palestinian view than the Israeli view, but he's quite balanced. But the important thing about that slide is his conclusion that there was nothing inevitable about the emergence of Israel. It was born in a fleeting moment in history when the stars were favourably aligned. Palestine was carved out of the carcass of the Ottoman Empire before Arab nationalism could gather its full force. It was created by an act of British colonialism at a time when empire building was already going out of fashion. In fact, when Theodor Herzl, who we'll talk about in a few minutes, wrote his book, The Judenstaat, or the Jewish State, in 1896, and talked about a Jewish state in Israel, he was called the Jewish Jules Verne. Jules Verne, of course, being an author who was famous for writing some wonderful science fiction books. So there was nothing inevitable about the establishment of Israel. In fact, I would suggest that it was a miracle, but that's up to you to decide. Tonight we're going to look at a whole lot of facts. And everything that I tell you tonight will be true. You will have heard of much of it, some of it maybe not. But it's all true, and it will be up to you to decide whether, in the midst of all of those true facts, there is a larger truth that is being disclosed. Now, many of you believe in a larger truth, but it won't hurt any of us, whether these things are new or whether they are old, to revisit them and to think again about whether all of these true things are actually the truth. And I would suggest that what we're going to find out is that the re-establishment of Israel was a miracle. Now, I want to start by turning back to Exodus chapter 7. A bit of a strange place to start. Exodus chapter 7 is a record of the events that led up to the Jews, or the Hebrews, coming out of Egypt. The Hebrews they were then. And in Exodus chapter 7, verse 2 to 3, this is God speaking to Moses, the great deliverer of Israel from Egypt. And he said, "Thou shalt speak all that I command thee, and Aaron thy brother shall speak unto Pharaoh, that he send the children of Israel out of his land. And I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and multiply my signs and my wonders in the land of Egypt." Now, some people struggle with that verse, and I understand why. A whole lot of events occurred that led to the Hebrews coming out of the land of Egypt, and Pharaoh's heart was hardened at the end of each of those events, 10 times, 10 plagues. And Pharaoh's heart was hardened until finally, after the last terrible plague, the Hebrews were not just allowed to leave Egypt, they were told to get out quickly. And sometimes people say, well, was it fair that Pharaoh's heart was hardened? Did he have any choice in the matter? Now, that's something for you to think about. In the record, you'll find that on 6 occasions it says that Pharaoh hardened his own heart, and on 4 occasions it says that God hardened Pharaoh's heart. And we're going to look at a whole lot of facts tonight, and then we're going to ask the question of ourselves, because I'm not going to pause at every fact. Is this God working, or is this man working? Are these a whole lot of coincidences, because they certainly are the choices of people that they made over the last 100 or so years? Or is it in fact a pattern that God is somehow controlling? Was the establishment of Israel an act of man or an act of God? And you can ask that question of yourself. I'm not going to attempt to answer it, because ultimately everyone has to answer for themselves what they think is truth and what they think is simply true. And truth is more important than things that are just true in the context that we're talking tonight. So you will need to think about that, and I would ask you to do so as we proceed. Now, in his opening prayer, Peter mentioned about the providence of God and the work of the angels. And I'm going to represent the work of the angels like a conference around a table. And there is an event in the Bible, which we won't talk about tonight, where it is presented exactly like that, where the angels were asked to come up with plans to bring about a certain situation in the Old Testament. Very interesting. You probably know it, but it doesn't matter if you don't. You can ask me later if you would like to be more information on that. So that's how I'm presenting it, a little lightheartedly as a group of people around a table, but not really lightheartedly, because that's meant to represent Jesus Christ and the angels sitting around a table in the last 100 or so years, asking questions and planning things out, because that's the way the Bible presents it. So at some point around the late 1800s, there was a question asked at a discussion like that, and I'm not being irreverent, please forgive me if you think I am, but something like that. It's time for the Jews to return to Israel. How can we start the process? Now, the process began thousands of years ago. You're in Genesis chapter 12, please. Genesis chapter 12 and verse 7. This is 4,000 years ago. 4,000 years ago. Verse 7 of Genesis chapter 12. The Lord appeared unto Abram and said, unto thy seed will I give this land. God said that to Abram, whose name was changed to Abraham, the father of the Jewish race. Unto your seed, your family, your offspring, will I give this land. So 4,000 years ago, God sowed into the heart of the founder of the Jewish race the idea that the land of Israel, and that's the land that he was talking about, was their land. Okay? I just want to establish this point strongly because we are weighing up the providence of God over the past 120 years, and it goes much, much further back than that. Jeremiah chapter 30 and verse 3, the prophet Jeremiah said this. This is about 2,600 years ago. He said, Lo, the days come, saith the Lord, that I will bring again the captivity of my people, Israel and Judah, saith the Lord, and I will cause them to return to the land that I gave to their fathers, and they shall possess it. And over in verse 11, I am with thee, saith the Lord, to save thee, though I make a full end of all nations. Whither I have scattered thee, yet will I not make a full end of thee, but I will correct thee in measure, and I will not leave thee altogether unpunished. Those words are in the hearts and minds of the majority of members of the Jewish race, and they have been for thousands of years. Every year, most Jewish families keep the feast of Passover. I suppose if we wanted an equivalent in Australia, it might be Christmas, although Christmas is not really a religious festival anymore, but most families in Australia get together on Christmas Day and they have a meal together. So the Jews on their Passover day, which is the 14th day of their first month, most of them sit down as a family and they remember the Passover when they came out of Egypt. And they have a meal full of significance and they talk about those events and they have a very enjoyable day too. And at the end of that meal, for 1,000 years or more, every one of those families said and says next year in Jerusalem. Now, of course, for the last 50 years, 60 years, they've been in Jerusalem. They still don't have their temple in Jerusalem. But for 1,000 years, and you can look back, there's records 1,000 years ago, it might be longer, the families have said next year in Jerusalem. And they've done so because 4,000 years ago, God promised their forefather Abraham that the land would be theirs. And Jeremiah said that even though you'll be dispersed amongst all nations, you will return. Now, this is a unique story, and we need to remind ourselves of that. There is no other story in history like this. There's no other people with a story like the Jews, nothing like it. And authors throughout history have written of how amazing the events that happened to the Jews are. Coming back to their land after being dispersed for 2,000 years, there is nothing else like it. So as you're thinking about these things, and deciding, perhaps for the first time, perhaps one of many times in your life, reminding yourself whether this is truth or not. Remember that. It's the only story like this, the only one. Okay, so we're going to look at the last 100 or so years around what's happened in the land of Israel, or the land of Palestine as it was called in 1880. And we're going to cover those historic events. We'll come to them one by one, but we're going to start with a Frenchman, a pharmacist and a feather. I've had a few people have, in fact, no one's known all of them. There's been a few guesses and a few people have known what I'm talking about, but no one's known all of them. Even what I would have thought would have been very, very learned students in history, so I was pleased with that. And a little worried, have I got something wrong here? But that's a trivial sort of heading, but there's a purpose for that. The providence of God, which we're looking at tonight, I believe, deals with big things, but it deals with little things too. And if you were to ask, well, what was the reason why the Jews came back into the land of Israel? People might say, well, it was the result of the Holocaust in the Second World War, and that's not untrue. But it was also the result of a lot of little things. A lot of little things. As that author LaGuardia said, there was nothing inevitable about the re-establishment of the Jews in the land of Israel. It was a little window that was open just for a couple of years, and a whole lot of big things and little things had to come together, and they had to go through it, and they did. Can you imagine if the Jews weren't in Israel today, let's call it Palestine, can you imagine the United Nations ever voting to form the nation of Israel? Not in your wildest dreams could you imagine that, could you? It wouldn't happen today. It wouldn't have happened for the last, I don't know how many years, but it did happen in 1947 because that little window was open for a little while. And we're going to look at some of the big things and some of the little things that made that happen. And we're going to start with a Frenchman. And his name is Captain Albert Dreyfus. You might have heard of Dreyfus. He was a French army captain and he was a Jew. And he was accused in 1894 of handing secret documents to the German Imperial Army. And as a result of that accusation, which was based on very, very slender evidence, he was stripped of his title, he was humiliated, and finally he was banished to Devil's Island off the north coast of French Guiana in South America, there to live the rest of his life in that horrible place. But new evidence emerged that he wasn't guilty, that someone else had done it. And the French government weren't really interested in listening because they were happy to have Dreyfus there, case closed. A lot of the French public were quite happy to have a Jew blamed for that, until a journalist named Émile Zola wrote an article, a famous article called J'accuse. I hope you like that French accent. J'accuse. I accuse. And it was an open letter to the President of France saying Dreyfus is innocent and it's about time something was done to rehabilitate him from Devil's Island down there and get him back into a reasonable life. The controversy continued for a year or two until finally in 1899, the President of France did grant Dreyfus a pardon and he came back to France. He was a broken man by then. Devil's Island, a very tough place. And what he had been through was very tough also. But finally, justice was done. However, in that process, the anti-Semitism that existed in France bubbled to the surface. It's a little bit like what's happening in the world today. Dreyfus was innocent and proven to be so, but there were demonstrations all over France and wider in Europe about the Jews, about people saying, no, he shouldn't be released. No, he's not innocent. Even if he didn't do that, look at what the Jews do. All of these things that were made up about the Jews. And so anti-Semitism bubbled to the surface in a very serious and scary way for the Jews, until a man named Theodor Herzl, who is sometimes called the father of modern Zionism, wrote a book called The Jewish State. and he began the Zionist movement. Now, Zionism is simply the belief that the Jews should have a land of their own in the land of Israel. Sometimes Zionism is defined in some rather odd ways, depending on who's saying it. And people shy away from the term because it can sound terrible, but that's all it means. The Zionists were people who believed that the Jews should have their own homeland in the land of Israel. And the book that Churchill wrote really commenced that work, that process. Okay, so that's the Frenchman. Now, the next thing that may have been asked in this imaginary table where conferences were taking place amongst the angels in heaven and the Lord Jesus Christ, how will we arrange for Britain, or Tarshish as it's called in the Bible, to play a key role in the establishment of Israel? Why do we say that that was the question? Because if you looked at Bible prophecy, and we haven't got time to do it now, you would find that the Bible says that Tarshish or Britain were to play a key role in the re-establishment of Israel as a homeland for the Jews. And so at some point, that question must have been asked. And the answer to the question was, in part, that man there. Now, it's interesting as to whether we all know who that is. Everyone my age knows who it is, and everyone middle-aged. Perhaps young people, do you all know who that is? Who do you reckon that is? He's an Englishman. That is Sir Winston Churchill, one of the greatest politicians of the 20th century, without doubt, one of the most significant politicians of the 20th century. He was Prime Minister in the United Kingdom during World War II and stirred that nation to defeat the Nazis. He was Prime Minister again in the 1950s, and he was indeed a very significant man. And Winston Churchill played a very important part in preparing the ground for the re-establishment of the Jews in the land of Israel. Why did he do that? Why was that seen to him, by him, to be something important? It's very interesting. Writing in the Testimony magazine in 2008, Mr. Paul Billington, a Christadelphian, wrote, "Certainly Winston Churchill was aware of Britain's mission with respect to the Jewish return." This writer, Paul Billington's grandfather, whose name was Mr. Butler, was employed by Churchill as his private chauffeur just prior to World War I, and discussed Bible prophecy with him at some length during those long journeys. On one occasion, they drove to London, and on the way, they discussed passages written by John Thomas in Elpis, Israel, especially those concerning Britain, Palestine, and the Jews. Isn't that amazing? That the knowledge of these things reached those in high places is certain. And those two pictures there show Mr. Butler, who also was a Christadelphian, in the driving seat of the car that he drove Churchill round him. And the other one is a picture of Mr. Butler, the chauffeur, with several of, Churchill's two children, Randolph and Sarah. Interesting. Churchill had a number of years where perhaps one of the men closest to him, his chauffeur, knew about what the providence of God had in store for the Jews as far as returning to Israel. Now, it's said of Churchill, he was an Anglican, didn't like the Catholics very much at all. He was not a particularly religious man. He wasn't a regular attender at church, but it is said that he had a very sharp instinct of the providence of God. He was very interested in the providence of God, and he felt that he himself had been chosen to work out some of the purposes of God that he understood from the Bible. So he wasn't particularly religious, but he had a very acute awareness of the providence of God. Now that's interesting. John Thomas was an author. He wrote Elpis Israel, that Mr. Butler read to Churchill, particularly sections on Bible prophecy. Now, John Thomas was just a Bible student and nothing more. He wrote in Elpis Israel, and I don't think there's any doubt that this would have been read to Churchill, I know not whether the men who at present contrive for the foreign policy of Britain entertain the idea of assuming the sovereignty of the Holy Land and of promoting its colonisation by the Jews. He was writing this in 1848, when all of these things were non-existent except in the pages of the Bible. Their present intentions, however, are of no importance one way or the other, because they will be compelled by events soon to happen to do what under existing circumstances heaven and earth combined could not move them to attempt. The British and every other nation had no real interest at all in what was happening in Palestine at that point. But on the basis of Bible prophecy, John Thomas wrote that soon they would. Look what Churchill said in 1920. If, as may well happen, there should be created in our own lifetime by the banks of the Jordan a Jewish state under the protection of the British Crown, which might comprise 3 or 4 millions of Jews, an event would have occurred in the history of the world which would, from every point of view, be beneficial and would be especially in harmony with the truest interests of the British Empire. Isn't that amazing? I wonder where Churchill got those thoughts from. As I said, there are big things that led to the Jews returning to Israel, but there are small things too. And here we have one of the most influential men in the 20th century whose mind was prepared by a Bible student who read to him things about Bible prophecy. So we move on to the Pharmacist. And that is Chaim Weizmann. That's how you got to say it, Chaim. I'm not clearing my throat. That's Mr. Chaim Weizmann. And he was a pharmacist. He was a Jew and he was a Zionist. And he was the very first president of Israel when they became a nation on May the 14th in 1948. So he was a very significant Jew of the 20th century. He was, along with Theodor Herzl, he was one of the founders of modern Zionism. He was also a pharmacist, a scientist who was working in Manchester at the outbreak of World War I. Now, you won't be able to read that, I don't think, or maybe you will. Good if you can. But what he did was, and this is one of those little things. I don't know the circumstances of the discovery that Weizmann made, but Britain needed acetone. Ever heard of it? Probably not. I didn't know a lot about acetone, but acetone is vital in the manufacture of cordite, and cordite was the material that the British used in World War I as gunpowder. So it was extremely important, and the British were running extremely short of cordite. Now, to make their acetone, they imported calcium acetate from Germany, who they were fighting against. So they had no way of getting more acetate from Germany to make more acetone, and they were running out of gunpowder, which means they were going to be beaten in World War I, because gunpowder was critical in World War I, probably still was in World War II as well, still is today. Enter a pharmacist, Chaim Weizmann, who was working up in Manchester, a young pharmacist who was also a Zionist. And he came up with a process of turning starch, potatoes. We've got heaps of potatoes in England. The potato famine's long over. He came up with a process of introducing bacteria to starch, and lo and behold, one of the byproducts is acetone. We can have as much acetone as we want, as long as we've got potatoes. Suddenly, the problem was solved by this clever young pharmacist. And as a result of that, of his invention and what it meant to the British, at the end of World War I, or during World War I, the Prime Minister of Britain during World War I said to Weizmann, "Thank you very much. You've basically saved our nation. What can we do for you? What would you like as a reward? Do you want to be Lord Weizmann? Do you want a magnificent estate somewhere in the middle of England? What do you want?" He said, "There's only one thing I want: a national home for my people." That was what the Pharmacist said. And as a result, the Balfour Declaration was issued in November 1917, and in it, Britain promised to facilitate the Jews making a return to their homeland in Palestine after almost 2,000 years. And that declaration was supported by a joint resolution of the Congress of the United States, and it led Jews everywhere to believe that the redemption of Palestine was assured. That was the work of the Pharmacist. Somewhere in a laboratory in Manchester, somehow the bacteria produced acetone and Britain was saved. Remarkable. Now we come to another discussion somewhere around 1910. And as I say, I don't mean this irreverently, but I think it helps to bring together the idea of divine providence. How can Britain begin to defeat the Ottoman Empire in Palestine? Because that's what had to happen. For the Jews to be able to return to the land, first of all, the Ottoman Empire, which controlled Palestine for 400 odd years, had to be defeated. They came up with a plan in 1915 called the Constantinople Agreement. And in the Constantinople Agreement, this is what nations were like in those days, colonial powers. They decided that the Russians were going to get part of Turkey, in particular the city of Constantinople or Istanbul, so that they would have access to the Mediterranean through the Straits of the Bosporus and the Dardanelles from their Black Sea ports. That was Agreement 1. The British were to have Persia, and the French were to have Syria and Palestine. That was the agreement. That was the map that they drew up in 1915. Unfortunately, on April the 25th in 1915 was, of course, the day, Anzac Day, the day that those poor Australian soldiers landed on the wrong beach, and what should have been such a simple victory for the powerful British Army, assisted by the Australians, turned into a disaster. They thought they would be in Constantinople or Istanbul within a week. They thought they could defeat those Turks easily, but they got it all wrong. Everything went wrong. And so the Constantinople Agreement, which was flying in the face of Bible prophecy, went wrong also. Because remember, we saw that Tarshish, or Britain, was the one that was going to have the power over the destiny of Palestine or ancient Israel, not the French. If Anzac Day had been successful, the French would have had Palestine and Syria and Lebanon and other areas, and the Jews would never have returned. And so a battle that should have been easily won was tragically lost. And of course, poor Australian soldiers were part of that tragedy, a horrible part of that tragedy. In steps the feather. So we've had the Frenchman, we've had the Pharmacist, now we've got the feather. That is an emu feather, as you probably know. And on the October 31st, 1917, it became very significant. At 4:30 p.m. on that day in Beersheba, now it's different. We tried up in Turkey, in Gallipoli, and the hugely powerful British Empire was defeated by a few Turks. Now we're going to try something different. Now we're going to try horses charging at cannons and rifles. Doesn't sound like a very smart idea. This is the Australian Light Horse, the 4th Australian Light Horse, very brave men, wonderful horses, and those soldiers wore emu feathers in their hats. If If you're driving into Sydney on the freeway, you might have seen there's a monument to the light horse, and they've got these huge plants that look like emu feathers in the middle of the highway for several kilometres, memorialising what these brave men did. So they came to Beersheba. They were out of water. The horses were about to die. Fancy using horses to take on cannons and rifles and modern military equipment, but that's what they did. So on that day at 4:30 p.m, the Australian Light Horse decided to make a cavalry charge to the Turkish positions in Beersheba in an effort to take over the wells of water there. If they succeeded, then they could move in and push the Turks out of the land, take Jerusalem, and eventually take Damascus, which was really the prize. That was the capital city of the area. But it all hinged on this: a 6.4 kilometre dash over open ground from their position to the city of Beersheba into the mouth of cannons. And a feather was very significant in winning that battle for them, because the Turks made a mistake. They saw the feathers in the distance and they said, oh, that's the Australian Light Horse. We recognise them by their feathers. Otherwise, they would have thought they were cavalry, and they would have thought, well, the cavalry's not going to charge our positions. That would be stupid. The Australian Light Horse were mounted infantry. Sorry to get technical here, but they were mounted infantry. So what the Turks expected was what mounted infantrymen normally did. They would ride halfway and then they would stop. They would take up their positions on the ground. They would set up their infantry equipment and try and win the battle that way. So the Turks got all ready for that. They set their cannons and their rifles, their men in trenches. Here they come. Halfway they'll stop. No, they haven't stopped yet. They must stop soon. They've got those feathers. They're not cavalry. They're not cavalry. They're not cavalry. That day they were cavalry. And by the time the Turks realised, it was too late. The Australian Light Horse, once they were into the full charge, and they only had bayonets because they were working as cavalry, the equipment that they had in those days was, of course, not as sophisticated as it is today. The Turks couldn't get the cannons down. They couldn't adjust the cannon. They started firing, but the horses were too fast, and they got underneath the cannons, and so the cannon balls were landing over the other side of the horses. Some men died. About 30 of the Australian Light Horse died. The men in the trenches panicked. They couldn't adjust their rifle sights quickly enough, and the Australian Light Horse won a battle they should never have won. They took the wells of Beersheba, and pretty soon they were up in Damascus. And also, on December the 11th, 1917, General Allenby walked into Jerusalem. And a few days later, the Balfour Declaration was signed. And that is the Balfour Declaration with a picture of Lord Balfour. Now, as we look at these things, just a reminder that some of these men were motivated by the Bible. There can be no doubt that by Balfour's time, the idea that the Jews would return to the ancient homeland at the end of history was an article of faith for many Christians, particularly in Britain. So, in an indirect way, or direct way if you like, God was motivating these people. God was behind these decisions because men were reading their Bible and believing that they were playing a part in God's purpose. So, as I said at the start, we asked the question of ourselves, was this God's work or was it the work of man? That's for you to decide. Now, very quickly, we come to a Doc, a Daisy and a Donald, okay? It's the second half. We haven't got far to go. I know this is a lot of information, but it is a remarkable story. After Churchill made that remarkable statement in 1921, the British turned against the Jews a little. This is this little tiny window of opportunity. What happened during that period of time was in 1848, when those words were written by John Thomas, nobody cared about oil. What was the value of oil? There was no oil engines, there was no cars, there was none of that. But by 1921, people started to realise that oil is everything. Oil is power. And the British started to realise that we can't afford to be on the wrong side of the Arabs, because it seems like a lot of the oil is just under the sand in the countries that they live in. So they started to turn against the Jews. And in steps a Doc, a Daisy and a Donald. Now back to our little conference. After the end of World War II, who will ensure that the United Nations vote to partition Palestine? Who will ensure that? Does anyone know who the main lobbyist was that achieved the vote in 1947 in favour of establishing a state of Israel in Palestine? Was it Churchill? Was it Truman, the President of the United States? Was it Clement Attlee, the President of the United Kingdom? Surely one of them. No, it was an Australian. Australia has been described as the midwife at the birth of the State of Israel in 1948. And the man who drove that vote was a man called Doc Evatt, a Labor politician who had been leader of the opposition. He was never Prime Minister of Australia, but he was Secretary-General of the United Nations in 1948 and 49, and he was the man that was appointed chairman of the committee that they formed to look at the question of Palestine in early 1947. And Doc Evatt was the one that drove through that vote. An amazing vote in November of 1947, when even the Russians supported the re-establishment of the State of Israel. As I said before, it would never happen now. It wouldn't have happened 20 years ago. Not in your wildest dreams, but it happened in November 1947. And Doc Evatt was the man that drove that through. Now, there's some of the other men that were active in that day. That's Chifley, the Australian Prime Minister, and that's Clement Attlee, the Prime Minister of the UK. And those men were not particularly religious. They didn't know a lot about the history of Israel. But Doc Evatt did. Isn't that interesting? Again, is it a coincidence? Or is it the providence of God? Doc Evatt and his brothers and sisters were raised in country New South Wales by a mother that loved her Bible. And Doc Evatt, history records, and those that examine what happened in 1947 have come to this conclusion. Doc Evatt's view of Bible history was Old Testament based. And that meant for Doc Evatt, the Jews back in the land of Israel was a prophecy that he knew about. And his mother, when he grew up, had trained him and her other children to read their Old Testament every day. And Doc Evatt kept doing that as he grew into adulthood. And when his time came in 1947, he understood that the Jews had to return to Israel. It was a matter of Bible prophecy. He'd been reading about that all his life. The Jews in the ancient land of Israel. And so he lobbied hard and brilliantly, and he achieved that quote in the providence, that vote in the providence of God. And Doc Evatt in Israel is a hero. He is a hero to the Jews because they recognise that he played the key role in that successful vote in 1947. So that's the Doc. Now we'll skip over President Truman very quickly. This is an amazing story. President Truman was president when the State of Israel was proclaimed. You probably know this story, but if you don't, it's amazing. It's a picture of Truman with his business partner, Eddie Jacobson. Eddie Jacobson was a Jew, and Eddie Jacobson and Harry Truman had fought together in World War I, and then they'd started a furniture business after World War I, and they went broke. And as history records, it's amazing they remain good friends because most people who go bankrupt together never talk to each other again. But Truman and Jacobs remained close friends. I'll run through this very quickly. I can see a couple of people yawning, and that's fair enough. But this is an amazing story. By 1948, when the State of Israel was proclaimed, the US State Department was worried. And they said to President Truman, in fact, they announced in March of 1948 that the United States government no longer supports particularly that the Jews are going to establish a nation in Israel, but we do support that the Jews are going to live in the area of Palestine. They didn't tell Truman they were going to say that in March of 1948, but that's what they said. It wasn't law by then, but that's what they said. Now, as the time of Israel declaring themselves to be a nation came about in May 14th, 1948, that was the line of the Secretary of State of the United States, a man named to establish a state of Israel. And so it was that in May 14th, 1948, the Jews announced that they were a state, and the United States of America, headed by Harry Truman, were the first nation in the world to recognise them. And there's a picture of Weizmann presenting Harry Truman with his very own copy of the Torah, for which he was very thankful. He said, I always wanted one of those. Isn't that an amazing story? Now, I think we've run out of time. The State of Israel was born in 1948. I think you probably all know the story of Lyndon Johnson. I must tell you about the daisy, by the way, first of all, because I did say the daisy and the Donald. That was the first ever political attack ad in 1964 when President Johnson, who grew up in a Christadelphian household, was running for president. And Barry Goldwater, the Republican, was doing well. Johnson was nowhere near as popular as Kennedy, who had been sadly assassinated. But the Republicans ran this attack ad, and there was a little girl there with a little daisy, and she was going, 10, he loves me not, she loves me not. And then halfway through, it gets, the sound changes, and it's 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, and at the end of it, this huge atomic explosion goes off. And the ad basically says that's what Barry Goldwater wants to do. He's a madman. He wants to blow up the world. They only ran the ad once, but history records that was very influential in making sure that Lyndon Johnson became president. Now, as I said, we've run out of time, so I'm not going to go into the story of LBJ other than to say that he grew up in a Christadelphian household. His father and grandfather were Christadelphians. His auntie was a Christadelphian. And even though he didn't adopt the Christadelphian faith and he became a president and a man of doubtful morals too, he never forgot what his grandfather had told him and his auntie. Look after the Jews. And in 1967, when the existence of Israel was again under threat and the US State Department was saying, do not support Israel, President Johnson, do not support Israel. We need the Arab oil. Russia's the bigger picture, and we cannot afford to lose out on that Arab oil. Johnson said, no, I'm going to support Israel. And he did. He armed Israel for the 1967 war, and he even allowed that war to go on it only went for 6 days, but he allowed it to go on for the last couple of days so that the Jews could achieve everything that they wanted in the war, including retaking the city of Jerusalem. So we'll leave it there. We were going to talk about the Donald as well, but we all know enough about him, and really it doesn't do to say what Donald Trump might do tomorrow, because nobody knows, including himself. But he too has been a remarkable man who has been influenced by Jews, his own son-in-law, and by the ecumenical church in America, who have convinced him that he can be a man of destiny too, much the way that Weizmann did for Truman. So thank you for listening. That has been a quick run through what is, I believe, a miracle. But that's up to you to decide. It's up to you to decide. Did all of that happen as a coincidence? Go back to the days of Pharaoh. Did Pharaoh push the Jews out of Egypt, or did God pull them out? And I think that there's no doubt that it was a miracle. that the establishment of Israel in the land today was a miracle that involved big things and little things, like a Frenchman, a pharmacist and a feather. Little things all contributed to that. And somewhere now there is a conversation taking place, I believe, that says it is time now for the kingdom of God on earth to be established. And that's not preempting what the actual date or year of that will be, but that is being discussed in heaven right now. And the question for all of us is, will we be ready for that great event?